Good evening, everybody. Thank you very much for coming. My name's Damien Carrington. I'm Head of Environment at The Guardian. I'm a journalist. And I'm delighted to be here this evening to chair the event called Righting Wrongs, held here at the Royal Society and in conjunction with the Royal Society for Literature also. The Righting Wrongs event hopefully will look at Rachel Carson's Silent Spring. It's 50 years since she died, and we want to see what we've learnt from her incredible book. And we also want to look at a broader aspect of what literature, science and policy, the different roles they play in protecting the planet. We're very lucky to have a fantastic panel who I'm going to introduce shortly. Just a couple of notes. If you could turn your phones off, that will help us focus on the matter in hand. That would be very kind of you. I'm asked to state there are no planned fire evacuations, and I have to point out the fire exit, which is there. So I have done that one. Just so you all know, the event is being webcast live, so anyone online will be able to click in and watch this as we go along. And I will ask the panel to come up now, if that would be okay, and I will introduce you once you're here. I think I'm sat at the far end, so... Yeah, okay. Right, thank you very much. I'm going to start at my far right with John Burnside, who is a prize-winning poet, short story writer, and a novelist, frequently inspired by the natural world and frequently troubling the judges of the T.S. Eliot Prize. He's a professor of creative writing at St Andrews University, and also from Dunfermline, which is where I went to school too. So I'm pleased to have you here. I also read you're a former software engineer, is that right?
Yeah, systems designer.
Very good. Well, welcome to John. In the centre we have Kerry Carter, who is the Director of Business and Biodiversity Offsets at Forest Trends. Amongst her many accomplishments, she is on the Natural Capital Committee, which the government has set up. She's formerly a barrister, member of the Secretariat for the first Earth Summit in Rio in 1992, and also been an advisor at Kew Gardens. So welcome, Kerry. And then finally, but by no means least, we have Professor John Pickett, who's a fellow here at the Royal Society. He is a research professor at Roehampstead Research in Harpenden and has almost 500 publications in the field of chemical ecology, which, and I'm sure John will correct me if I get this wrong, is to do with examining how chemicals like pheromones allow plants, insects, animals to interact with one another.
Perfect.
Is that fair? Okay. I've got off to a good start. So what I'll do is I'll just go and take my seat now and we shall begin the discussion. So, as I mentioned just a moment ago, we are here today, partly because of the 50th anniversary of the death of Rachel Carson. Now, I won't give a long introduction because I know you want to hear from the panel. All I'll say is that when I got the job doing environment at The Guardian about 6 years ago, I phoned a friend of mine, a man called Fred Pearce, who's a very well-known environmental journalist, and said, Fred, I've got this new job and I don't really know much about it. What do I need to read? And the first thing he said was Silent Spring, and that was it. So I did. So it certainly meant a lot to me. But I want to start with that and ask the panellists, what does Silent Spring, this book which has made such a difference and is remembered so long after it was published, mean to the panel individually, both from how it was written and also in terms of its impact? I might come to you first, John. I mean, was it the facts and figures that were arrayed in a good way, or was there something special about the way it was written as well? I know you've read all of her work, which of course is not always seen in or as well remembered.
Yeah, well, I think also I've been reading Silent Spring now for about 30 years, I guess. Not all the time. I read Moby Dick all the time, but Silent Spring occasionally. But one sees different aspects of Silent Spring as time has passed. And of course, in its own time, in its own day, what was important was the example that was set in terms of how we think about the use of pesticides in our natural surroundings. But I think more so these days, what Rachel Carson's valuable for is she's making points that are fundamental points, that if you're interested in ecology and if you're interested in activism related to ecology, are actually absolute fundamentals. And so 50 years ago, she was making points that are still valid today and also are still being ignored today. And I think that's the sense of prescience. Most important about that book, which is different from her other work, I mean, you know, she was asked to do Silent Spring because she was a famous writer about nature, and she'd written this brilliant trilogy about the sea, about the animals and birds and etc. live around or in the sea. And because she'd gained such a standing as a nature writer, she was asked to talk about what was happening with regard to DDT and other chemicals that were being used. And she didn't want to do that. She really didn't want to do it. She didn't feel she was the right person to do it. She thought it should be done by an investigative journalist. And in the end, the burden came onto her to do it because nobody else would do it. So it was a very different kind of book for her. And what's really amazing is how she tackled it, how she reckoned and how to make the point without being combative, without turning people off with the facts and figures, etc. That was the first book that really made a difference in terms of the politics that nature writers were doing. You know,
can I ask you a quick question? You're someone who works with words every day. I'm wondering, do you think the investigative journalist would have been able to write a book which has lasted so well and made such an impact, or was there something about the fact that she came from that kind of natural world writing world that helped? Do you think?
No, I think it would have been a very different book. In fact, in a way, what she did was turn herself into a kind of investigative journalist up to a point. But I think the quality of her style and her, I mean, she was in many ways a very plain-speaking kind of writer. Although there are rhetorical moments, that she isn't one of those writers that go, you know, that kind of goes over the top. She's accessible in the sea books. Children can certainly read the sea books, for example. And she was very keen to have her work. She wrote for children often. She was very keen to make her work accessible to people who had no scientific training or even particular interest in the natural world.
Sometimes writing the simplest sentences is the most difficult. But let me move on to Kerry Tenkati. Silent Spring, what does it mean to you? How's it? You've had a long and distinguished career in the environmental field. What role has it played?
Well, it was part of my conversion because, as you mentioned, I was a barrister originally, and I'd known long before qualifying as a barrister that I wanted to work on environment and development. But in common with many people with a legal background, I was kind of hunting around for the best way to make a difference and where that niche would be. And a little bit like you, Damien, when you rung up Fred and said, what should I read? I went through a period of reading everything I could lay my hands on. And obviously the tone and the nature of those publications varied. There were a lot of quite austere policy tomes. There were a lot of science books, some of which, as I'd only done A-levels and S-levels in science, were way above my head. And then there was Silent Spring. And it struck me that it was in a category of its own because it's very much evidence-based. The science is there. It's not blinding. It's very accessible. It's written in straightforward English. And it's not divorced from a level of advocacy, which is to do with what people feel about these things, the way the communities reacted to the evidence that they were seeing. And I think it was, for me, the combination of this sort of, to me, new concept of evidence-based popular science and things that move people and inspire them to do something that really caught my imagination at the time.
That's great. I'll turn to you, John. You eminent scientist, you come at it from this angle. What does Silent Spring mean to you in your work, which is obviously related in some way?
Well, I think as you described my career, I'm obviously working on alternatives to pesticides. So you might feel that I've benefited more than anybody from Rachel Carson's Silent Spring. But I think that there was the feeling growing in the scientific community that we would anticipate resistance to chemicals that we were using in a very intensive manner, and that there would be environmental impacts of that. What wasn't realised, I think, was the fact that this was being appreciated in scientific circles, but perhaps insufficiently in commercial policy and agricultural practice, and indeed disease vector control practices. And so what I regard the book as is a literary work that made some very, what I would say, poetic statements about what could happen, and that caught people's imagination. And so they started to take these issues seriously, which in turn created a framework in which we could get to grips with what we needed to do to control pests, avoid over-contamination of the environment, deal with toxicity and unexpected versions of that, and try to do better. And I think finally it opened up a very important debate, which we're continuing to have here tonight and in many other forums. And I think that's the most healthy thing that you can do. Whilst we might complain that it wasn't sufficiently evidence-based, because it is a work of literary value, I think. It's not evidenced in the normal way that you would have a scientific work. But whilst we can argue with that, it did open up the subject in a dramatic way, in a way we all know whether we like the book or not. And I think that really deserves great respect. And we should take it forward, I think, knowing that we have learnt from things, that we haven't actually had a silent spring, that we won't have one from this cause, but that we do need to feed ourselves, and we still need to control insects that carry pathogens.
Sure, I'm sure we'll come back to the science later. I'm sort of interested in the sort of literary impact, as you're saying. I mean, your bread and butter, if you like, is data and evidence and reproducibility and testing hypotheses and so on. I'm wondering, to what extent, whether it's literature, art, or kind of popular culture, kind of affects you as a scientist, right? You can't be immune from that. You're not sort of literally in an ivory tower. I'm wondering how that interacts with your work, and I'll come to the other panellists in a moment.
I really think that we can very easily stay in ivory towers. I think it's really very important that those of us who wish to and can do engage with public and engage with people's concerns. We're not all able or willing to do that, so it's an inhomogeneous group of people, but I think that it is crucially important because we are servants of you all, and we're really doing work that is expected to help in terms of producing food, and we need to take public opinion with us and explain what we're doing so that people can judge for themselves in an informed way.
So sorry, you're saying you shouldn't be in an ivory tower, or you should be?
The science shouldn't be in an ivory tower,
right?
Quite
okay.
Definitely. But I mean, we do have spectacular geniuses who work better in that way, and some who don't, and some who can spend more time on public engagement. That's really all I was referring to.
Well, thank you. That's great. Kerry, I'm going to come to you because you've worked in sort of policy areas in large parts of your career. I wonder, does science always tell you what the answer is, or and then how does art or literature, as we're calling silent spring, and other forms of information and feelings, how does that flow into the sort of policy decisions that get taken, whether it's about pesticides, global warming, other issues? Does science have all the answers? What
a marvellous question. Well, wouldn't it be lovely if it did? Because difficult as science may be, nonetheless it would be somewhat simpler than the whole barrage of factors that we have to use to influence policy or that are taken into consideration in policy. I think I mentioned earlier that one of the things that's striking about Rachel Carson, perhaps not sort of peer-reviewed science in the traditional academic way, but nonetheless adducing some levels of scientific evidence, in fact, that she brings to the debate. And policy does need to be evidence-based. So clearly we need the science behind it, but I don't think that's enough for a number of reasons. Firstly, it doesn't convince people. It certainly doesn't convince the public. It's not that accessible to them. And many policymakers are not scientists by background either. So they're needing interpretation and translation, which is obviously a tricky job, but somebody's got to do it. So the question is, what means do we use? What's at our disposal to raise awareness, to elicit responses, to clarify opinion and make evidence accessible? And I think that literature has a really important part to play. Firstly, because it's often very lucid, and it forces people who, I'm in a horrible space at the moment, everything I write is policy wonkery. It's like a language of its own, UNEs. And I'm not sure that it's at all accessible. I'm worried sometimes that it's removed every iota of imagination that I probably had as a child and just replaced it with these blocks of UN-type words that you can interchange to sort of convey your feelings. But I think reading literature and other forms of writing and help you make your work accessible. They remind you that there is beauty in the form that you can communicate in, and that it's something to aspire to because it's just much more interesting and accessible. You're likely to get your message over far better. And then secondly, if I could just finish, I think it's balm for the soul. Not only is it necessary to be able to do these things in order to do your job well, frankly, a lot of people who work in environment and development are faced with grueling problems and horrid situations and a lot of complexity day in, day out that they're working with. And it's really important to be able to escape into beautiful language. It keeps you going. So, yeah.
Brings me very nicely to John, who's familiar with beautiful language. I mean, I could turn the question around, which I asked the other John to start with. You know, how does culture, art, literature influence his work as a scientist? I'm kind of wondering, as someone who spent a lot of time observing the natural world, writing about the natural world, finding ways to communicate that. I mean, does science kind of play a part in that? And I'm also wondering, in the public policy debate that Kerry was talking about, what role is there for the imagination? I mean, you know, if I've been at Conservative Party conference, I've just been at Labour Party conference, I'm at Lib Dems next week, and the idea of talking about imagination at any of those would be, would be kind of shocking. I'm just wondering, as someone, you know, familiar with that world, what role do you think it can play in these debates about how we care for the planet?
Well, I think the job of artists, say, generally, is to be people who contend, who say no, stop, think about this more. And I think that's a necessary role. I don't think it's the only role in town, but it's a necessary role. Somebody has to be there to say, well, wait, no matter how intelligent your system that you've designed is, there's a hole in it. And I know this from the point of view of being a systems designer. The first thing you learn when you're doing systems design is if your system's incomplete, then it's probably dangerous. You know, because of where the area of incompleteness is, maybe a horrible black hole, you know? So I think the role of artists and writers, etc., is to say, well, is your system complete? Do you think your system is so wonderful that you can just use it without really figuring it out? We know what the basic principles of the natural world are. Lao Tzu, in the 5,000 years ago, whatever it is, in the Tao Te Ching, tells us that, you know, the Tao, that he calls Tao, which is a nonsense word like God, is this kind of principle that organizes nature. You can't talk about it, you can't name it, but you can see it in practice. You can see it all the time around you, in the way water flows and the way the wind, etc. So we know that there are these kind of basic facts of nature, which and basic principles, if you like, which if you go against them, no matter how intelligently or imaginatively it seems that you are doing it, you're breaking a law, you're breaking some kind of basic law. One of the things that's wrong with today's society is that we're in love with innovation. You know, if it's new, it must be good. And, you know, scientists aren't the culprits here, it's technologists. It's the people who work for the companies who want to sell us new things, whether it's when in Rachel Carson's time, she's pointing out they're producing all these new compounds, which they're given to suburbanites in their back gardens to spray at will, or to farmers who don't really know what's going on, to apply with aircraft, etc. So, you know, this overwhelming of the old basic principles, if you like, by the desire for innovation, because innovation makes money, is something that we all want to say, stop. Wait, is this right?
Right. And go back to the beginning of your argument there. Your suggestion is that artists, writers have that kind of freedom to think into those spaces which haven't that you know, science hasn't explored yet. Is that?
Yeah. We've got much more freedom now because people don't pay as much attention to us as they used to. You know, obviously this is the age of science, and you know, Shelley says poets are the unacknowledged legislators of the world. Well, maybe they were in his day. As Jeremy Paxman pointed out on Tuesday night, poetry is irrelevant these days. You know, we're kind of lonely voices in the wilderness, a la Thoreau. But Thoreau was also, of course, he wasn't just a nature writer and a romantic or anything like that. He was also a surveyor. He was, you know, a talented surveyor, and he was a very acute observer of the natural world in a certain mode. Of course, you wouldn't call it scientific, but that imaginative mode of engaging with the natural world is something that we want to be to be reminding people is not only still valid, but it's the kind of basic approach. You have to approach the world with a sense of wonder as well as that kind of inquiry. And Rachel Carson said contentiously, knowledge is not enough, you have to have wonder as well.
That's a good point. John, I was going to ask you, I mean, John here was saying that, kind of Rachel Carson blew the whistle, if you like, on this misuse of the technology, the science. I mean, do you think scientists would prevent that today in the way that it's operated, or sort of allied to that?
Absolutely today. But it isn't just science, as John said. It's the way science is used by society, and of course, we are quite capable of making horrendous weapons and means of torture, but we're also quite capable of helping solve problems. And of course, we would like to be in that mode by and large, and it's up to society at large to decide where that is. I mean, I thought it was a wonderful point that John made there about the fact that there has to be some element beyond science, and I don't think we would at all look to a world without art. I mean, the society itself here has been founded on science and art, and that is greatly respected, not just in a token way. And I think that excitement, that wonder and so on, and also the feeling that, when you do have to interfere with nature, and sadly, just to grow a row of cabbages, that's an interference with nature. I mean, it's a monoculture, and you have to construct that, But just to do that, we should be aware of the fact that we are doing something which requires us to perturb what nature is doing.
Let me ask you a question. Do you think that there is a need for... I mean, is anyone acting in the way like Rachel Carson did 50 years ago about today's problems? Is that necessary, or is that no longer necessary? I want to ask Kerry that in a minute as well. But
well, I mean, with climate change, of course, we as scientists had to fight very, very hard to have accepted the idea that human activity was leading to climate change. And so you could offer that as an example of scientists trying to get it right. I mean, I'm worried where we have scientists of all kinds, and that some of them seek to make a career out of frightening people. With weaker evidence, I'm worried that some journals are very happy to publish that because they want the circulation. We try continually to do something about that, but it happens. So you can't say that scientists alone will fix it. And I think that for people to make poetic observations, stark observations, with statements like Silent Spring, that does make society generally sit up and question what's happening. But then you've got to really deal with some very complicated issues that we have notoriously been bad at explaining and engaging people with. And I think that's the other bit.
Maybe we'll get into this idea, because science can be quite complex sometimes, and maybe art has a role in explaining that. But let me ask Kerry a question. John just there was saying that, mentioned climate change, and of course, lots of scientists have worked in that field, and the scientific consensus is fairly settled. However, I write about this every week. Carbon dioxide is still zooming upwards, right? Not a lot's happened. I mean, do we need a silent spring for climate change? Why hasn't that happened? Or maybe somebody has. I mean, what role is that kind of combination of investigative journalism that John Burnside was talking about before, and the kind of artistic approach? What role could that play today? Or?
Oh, hugely important. In fact, John Burnside said something intriguing before we arrived on the podium, which was apparently Rachel Carson had been contemplating writing on climate change. And then, as he described, events pushed her into writing Silent Spring, and she did an admirable job. But would that she had survived long enough to have done the climate change one as well? And wouldn't it be fabulous to have a new generation version of that? Because I think there are sort of different niches. There are ecological niches for writers and communicators of all kinds, whether they're in scientific institutions, whether they are in investigative journalism, whether they're in the NGO community, members of the public. There are lots of different ways to communicate, and I think we're going to need more, because, as you say, the action is not commensurate with the problem. And I think the science, as you say, settled opinion on the science tells us that things are heading in a certain direction. And I think that there is a much higher level of understanding and awareness and acknowledgement of that now amongst policymakers than there was even 5 years or 10 years ago, for sure. But for various political reasons, it's extremely difficult to garner decisions to do anything about it. And where does political will come from? Partly it comes from politicians believing there's a groundswell of popular opinion amongst their electorate that wants to see action. So I think there would absolutely be room for a silent spring of climate change.
John, I know you want to make a point there, but let me just ask you a question which occurred to me, which is that there actually has been quite a lot of literature and art and plays and photographs and paintings, all sorts of things in relation to climate change, and yet, no single piece has certainly had the breakthrough effect, that Silent Spring did, at least from this distance looking back. And I wonder, you sort of kind of self-deprecatingly referred to poets not being relevant these days, I wonder if we just live in a busier multimedia world, is that part of the problem, or do you think people are making breakthroughs? And I know you wanted to make another point, so please do.
Well, actually, one of the things that's interesting about the Rachel Carson situation was that when the chemical companies were really, really confident they could knock her down. And maybe there were many factors that they didn't know about that helped her stand up. One is she knew she was dying. She knew she wasn't going to live for very much longer. And she was absolutely stubbornly, going to fight this corner because she had pledged everything to it, including giving up her research. What I think big companies have done since then, one of the lessons they've learned from the Silent Spring experience was we need to do much better PR. And in fact, huge amounts of money are invested in PR by all companies, etc. And so although ordinary people might drive policy, they're also subject to a constant bombardment of lies and misinformation and disinformation. So they're not through any fault of one's own, because we're all very busy as well, much busier than we thought we were going to be. We thought we were going to have these devices that would do all the labor for us. Apparently not. We haven't got time to really inform ourselves properly. The web could help, but of course, if you go into, say, certain areas of the web to try and find information, you find the PR guys from the big companies have been there in front of you and rewritten the Wikipedia page appropriately to their product. I've seen this happen.
John, we'd be very keen to get together with you and try and deal with this, because it is a very serious problem, and it prevents effective engagement, because they may say, "Oh, John Pickett works for a big chemical company." I don't, in fact, but you can say that, and then that means that whatever I say is really not relevant because I'm just in the service of this company. This has been said of me, even in your newspaper, actually.
Is it by me?
Not actually you.
I wouldn't have thought so.
I mean, I say this with a certain amount of pain as a Guardian reader, but I think the fact is that we don't really seem to quite catch a new way of doing this, which Rachel Carson did at the time. And we do need to really think innovatively about this, because at the moment, if we are going to engage on climate change, and as you quite rightly say, Damien, we haven't really done anything about it. And the one that I was talking to you about earlier, that of food security, a very, very serious problem coming towards us much faster than we can generate technology to deal with it by, then we really do need to get that into the public mind.
Okay. Kerry, I just want to come to you. I mean, in a way, I've got slightly depressed there listening to the two of you, because it sounded like you're making an argument that a kind of breakthrough moment like Silent Spring, a kind of change of awareness on a very broad level, isn't really possible now because there's so many conflicting messages. I don't know whether, say you worked...
No, I didn't mean that. I think we should think innovatively about engaging much more on important issues and try and sidestep the advertising that may be in the opposite direction.
Well, fine, but look, my question is, would another Silent Spring, if someone with the talent and the will was around to do it, is that possible now, or 50 years ago in this
I don't think
narrow...
it would be like that.
I want to ask Kerry, John.
Sorry.
Well, I'm interested now to hear why it wouldn't be like that. I think it's entirely possible. I think it's a kind of glass half full, glass half empty thing. So I agree with you that people are perhaps more cynical, they're perhaps more shy of forming opinions because they think they're being manipulated by the information and the sources of the information behind them. On the other hand, people are far more literate, they're better educated, they're more aware, and I think people are learning to be more discriminating about where they get their information. So I think that it's entirely possible for
Well,
people.
what was it then? I mean, any of you, what was it then specifically about this book which enabled it to persuade people for them not to think, here's this, you know, I mean, there was a lot of sexism in those days as well. Here's this crazy, hysterical woman talking about the danger in the natural world. I mean, what was it, I know, John, maybe about that book that was persuasive and convincing?
She had the standing based on her previous work.
Right.
The things that the chemical company said about her were, why would this spinster be so interested in the effects of, on unborn children? She's not going to have children of her own. As if that's the only reason you'd be concerned about the next generation of kids. They said she was a hysterical woman. They also said she was a communist. Because of course everybody who said anything was a communist.
Because she was attractive and unmarried, they decided she must be a communist.
Must be a communist, yeah. There were other things that were said, not only by the company's PR, but actually leading scientists in the government who actually chipped in on this. But she had this standing, and she had, of course, this unique, the very special personality, which was she was a very strong person, but she didn't look it. She seemed like this she looked like you'd rather ask her to knit you a sweater than go out and solve a problem of major political importance. But the other thing that happened was that John F. Kennedy read the New Yorker articles and took an interest. And that's sort of serendipitous to some extent. She was getting that kind of attention, she was getting people to think about it. But when somebody, a major figure like this also jumps in, then it makes all the difference. Now, I don't know if we found somebody to write the same thing and we gave it to, I don't know, Boris Johnson, say, or David Cameron. I wonder what difference that would make,
Well, it's interesting.
Damien, I think it's also to do with the issues. So the issues were, to a degree, tractable. Science has looked for alternatives, and I think when you get to climate change, it's so incipient in absolutely everything. It's so embedded in every supply chain, in all our behaviour. It's kind of harder, and we are the ones who have to fix it. It's not an agrochemical company or a farmer spraying. Right. It's all of us, and I think it's harder for people to take that on the chin. So the message is perhaps less palatable because you can't push it into somebody else's camp to deal with.
Yeah, I just want to sort of. I'm going to come to the audience shortly for questions, so start thinking of good ones, please. But I wanted to think about how Rachel Carson's approach, which has been so well described by the panellists here, how, if she was here today, how would she be dealing with some of the situations? And one of the things which I suspect many people in the audience are aware of is that there's some controversy over a class of pesticides used today called neonicotinoids. The European Union decided to impose a moratorium for 2 years on the use of 3 particular classes of those chemicals because of fears over impacts on bees and other pollinators. There's obviously arguments in the other direction saying that they're safe. And I'm just wondering, I'll start with you, John. What do you think Rachel Carson might have made of this situation today where, there's this...
I suspect that a person of her talents would be on other things, on bigger things, on things where there was, in fact, growing evidence. Because, as you say, although I've criticised the book in that respect, she was searching for evidence. A lot of the evidence wasn't there. It was purely correlated because of difficulties in analysis and so on. Just because... some scientists say one thing and some scientists say another. You can't judge whether who is right by just looking at the social science of it. You've actually got to look at the evidence. And we really don't feel in the bulk of the scientific community that we have a serious risk with the neonicotinoids. We do see that they are insecticides. Bees are insects. If you bring them into contact, they will do things to the bees. The whole registration package, which you may object to it being not in the public domain because it relates to proprietorial issues, and that is the nature of our business community to do that approach, to take that approach. But there isn't really any evidence of a major risk. And in fact, this year's returns on bees is going to come out really very well. And it predates the fact that we now have a restricted use of something.
Scientists, you wouldn't look at 1 year's data, but
listen,
I don't want to get too distracted on the specifics
I don't either,
of that
because
argument.
It's not really centralist. I don't think Rachel would give a big issue towards that. I think she would be working on bigger things, more important things, climate change and food sustainability and its production for a very rapidly growing world population, aggravated by
Let me just
climate
ask you
change.
one additional question then, because you said, one lot of scientists says this, the other group of scientists says another thing. So who gets to decide?
Well, it's decided on evidence, and you can't just say because there are a couple of papers in Science and Nature that is the irrefutable evidence, because all high-impact journals like that have a readership to consider, and obviously sensationalism plays a part in that. And regrettably, it can override the peer review process, but in fact, there are a lot of publications and a whole load of money that's gone into public estimation of what the neonicotinoids could possibly do in the environment that says we don't have a major risk here. What we are going to do is lose the neonicotinoids in the European arena, nowhere else in the world, but in Europe, when we've done that, we will have to use chemicals that probably are less safe to bees.
Right, so you say it should be decided on the evidence, and the European Union considered it and issued a moratorium. So they didn't use the evidence. Is that your argument?
The European Food Standards Agency considered the evidence and was not in favour of a moratorium, but then it was brought about by political lobbying, which is not a good way to go. And is
so
not
politicians who
evidence-based.
we elect shouldn't get to decide what happens?
That wasn't the way it worked. The way it worked was that there was lobbying in that restricted area. Of course, politicians come in with a general remit to do things.
Okay.
They then need the evidence.
Okay, thanks. Kerry, do you think Rachel Carson, John's suggesting that Rachel Carson wouldn't have worried about this particular issue. It seems, I don't know, what do you think?
I didn't know the lady, unfortunately. I would have thought that even if she weren't working on that particular specific topic, she would have applied the same kind of principles to her thinking on it, warning of potential risks, balancing those with potential advantages, and ultimately you have to trust the policymakers to take the science into consideration. One observation I have is just noticing that policymakers rarely sit up at night reading Nature and Science and every last piece of scientific literature, and they need, by virtue of the limited time they have, to rely on advisors. And those advisors have a very important role to play, and it's quite noticeable that different advisors within the same department over different periods of time offer different advice based on available evidence. So I think there is a great deal of room for manoeuvre, shall we just say.
Okay, I'm going to come to John Burnside, and then I will come to the audience for questions. I know you said earlier that the book Silent Spring kind of introduced some principles, which have been applied since. Do you think maybe in this specific case of the neonicotinoids, or in another example you may care to choose, do you think those lessons have been learnt?
Not in the least. I think some people are catching. I think Rachel Carson was ahead of her time in certain ways, and in terms of our society, she knew stuff that people in indigenous societies know, for example, have known for millennia. But I think what she would work on now was probably be a range of things. I certainly think she'd be interested in, obviously she'd be interested in climate change. She was already interested in climate in the late 50s. But I think she would also be interested in what we were doing about it. She would, of course, like most rational people, say, climate change is happening, we're contributing N to that, and then just think, are we really doing the right things to try and stop our contribution to climate change? And I think she was very good at looking at how business operates. And also she was very good at understanding that no matter how much evidence people have, if they want to decide something, they'll decide that way. We all know that we went into the Iraq war with Mr. Bush, absolutely based on evidence. One paper that somebody dug up from somewhere that some crackpot had written. And the whole government decided on that basis that Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction, etc. So we know how politics work. She knew then how politics works. I think she'd be looking really hard now at the lies that are being told about how our renewable energy policies are. That was what I think she'd be really interested in that. I think she'd be interested in food, of course she would, because I don't know what she'd have to say about it, what proposal she'd have, because it's a pretty thorny subject. But I think she can really knock down a few of the paper tigers with regard to renewables. And that our energy policy is being driven by landowners and big companies. She'd have something to say about that.
Okay, that's a great thought to turn to the audience on. I'm afraid the lights are slightly in my eyes, but I will endeavour to point to people. So there's a gentleman there with a tie on. I'm going to take 2 or 3 questions.
You're the only one.
Yeah, forgive me. So, yeah, I'll start with you, and then there's another gentleman with his hand up afterwards. If you don't mind just saying who you are, that would be great.
Hi, I'm Matt Shardlow from Buglife, the Invertebrate Conservation Trust. I feel I have to put you a little bit straight on what happened with EFSA, with the European Food Standards Authority, because what happened was they did a risk assessment and they recommended as a result that the risks they identified were high and were unacceptable. They didn't propose the solution. That solution was then proposed by the bureaucrats, by the European Commission. The politicians then couldn't agree, actually, so the politicians had very little influence over it at all because they couldn't agree on a way forward. It went then back to the Commission to make an agreement about what needed to happen with neonicotinoids. So it was a very bureaucratic and evidence-based process, actually. And the question is really for John, which is earlier you said you felt it was...
We have 2 Johns.
Sorry, John Pickett. That you felt it was not possible that there would be a silent spring. And I wonder, given the recent research just a few weeks ago from Holland showing a correlation, a very strong correlation, between declines in farmland bird populations and the levels of concentration of neonicotinoids in water bodies, where your confidence comes from.
Okay, good question. Thank you, Matt. And there was another gentleman at the back.
Yeah, very different question. I was intrigued that you said there wasn't a natural successor to Rachel Carson, particularly around climate change. But I was wondering whether it was Al Gore was her heir, and that rather than literature, it was perhaps depressingly film and TV and PowerPoint that had taken that on. But it seems to me that Al Gore played an important role in raising climate change in the public consciousness.
He also invented the internet, I'm told.
Well, okay, I'm just going to take one more question from the lady down here. If we can just wait for the microphone. If you don't mind saying who you are, that'd be great. Sorry, do you want to put your hand up again, just so they can give you the microphone?
Valerie Dalton, the Live Literature Company. I'd be interested to know from each individual panelist their opinions of Friends of the Earth and Greenpeace, and if they have a preference, and if so, what the reason is for that.
Okay, well, it's a whole menagerie of questions there, all very different in their own way, and thank you very much for those. I might start with John Pickett. Brathamsted has seen visits.
Let me apologise for condensing the story about Europe and
don't expand on it, please, because we haven't got that much time.
Yeah. Shall I answer?
No. I mean, feel free to answer, but I don't want to get into the comatology of Brussels.
And you referred to the paper recently in Nature on a correlation between this group of insecticides, the neonicotinoids, and bird health. And it is only a correlation. It's very surprising that it was published in such an august journal in general terms. I don't think it bears a great deal on the subject. I certainly agree that with EFSA that there's always more you can do, but when we really ought to be looking perhaps for much better and intrinsically less impacting ways of controlling pests, then I don't think that going through a fairly low risk situation at worst is very useful or valuable in terms of resources.
John,
so I don't regard that paper very highly at all.
Okay, well, you've made that clear. Can you? I just want to interested in your opinion specifically on the lady's question, which is because I know that Brathamsted has had visits, unwelcome visits in the past from some of the environmental NGOs. I just wonder whether you think they contribute in a useful way to the debate.
I think, in terms of gathering together people's worries, then, they can offer a useful role, but I think they are there really to gather together the worries and thereby to seek support. So I don't think it's always very informed. It's certainly not evidence-based. You can say what you like if you don't have to operate within the constraints of being a scientist. But nonetheless, they're part of the debate, and I greatly respect their role and their function in doing that. And I think, you know, we have to engage with all elements of critique and positive support.
Thanks very much, John. Kerry, I just want to ask you, I mean, I sort of want to roll in the other gentleman's question as well, which is that, you know, has film, I mean, certainly when you look at media coverage, there was a peak of concern in terms of writing in newspapers and so on about global warming around the time of The Inconvenient Truth, like 2006-07 was a high point, and so it had that effect. But I wonder whether you think kind of films, or perhaps referring to the lady's question, you know, campaign groups are taking the place which was occupied by that book, that piece of literature from Rachel Carson 50 years ago.
Well, there are certainly many more media now, aren't there, and people are more savvy and they're using them, and I think we need to be very broad in our approaches to grab people's attention and make the case. So I think An Inconvenient Truth raised a lot of people's awareness and level of understanding on the issues. It's not the only piece of literature out there, but the fact that it came with the IPCC in terms of getting Nobel Prizes, and you referred yourself on a contentious issue to have a kind of core backbone of solid science that people regard and broadly trust, which has been seen through various surveys in the community, is fabulous. So I think it's been hugely valuable. Films, you know, I thought for the longest time, wouldn't it be fantastic if we could get together a pile of DVDs covering 15 or 20 issues, and we made sure that, you know, the marine issues, the climate change issues, the food security issues, the biodiversity issues, the whole suite. And there are already good films, documentaries and films out there. Could we not put them in every school and make sure that there was such a library? I think it would be fabulous. And then you mentioned other things like campaigns. I have great respect for NGOs who are campaigning NGOs. When I was a policymaker in the UN doing intergovernmental negotiations, and sometimes negotiations would be stopped because somebody would be hanging a banner behind us or climbing down a rope or doing whatever they were doing, you felt perhaps a little cross and frustrated. But actually, I've got to say, some of the groups that I feel were more in the proselytizing, well, I'm not referring to those two NGOs that the lady mentioned, but generally there's an ecological niche and there are people who are in that quarter. And I've seen that they have actually improved the common denominator and the outcome of negotiations. So I've got a lot more tolerance and patience, much as I'm sometimes frustrated.
John Burnside, I felt you reacting to the mention of Al Gore there, so you should have your say on. I mean, do you think that film was, you know, should in any way be compared to Silent Spring?
No, absolutely not. No. And another way, Al Gore should be compared to Rachel Carson. Al Gore was just an opportunist politician jumping into something that, you know, he did actually literally claim that he was responsible for putting computers on every school child's desk in America or something, that he basically brought the internet to American children. I mean, he's a politician, he's an opportunist. He got the Nobel Prize. I mean, look at the list of people who got Nobel Prizes who are politicians. You know, Henry Kissinger got a Nobel Peace Prize, for God's sake. So, no, I mean, there are people who have been really working in their fields for decades, in all kinds of areas, writers and filmmakers and agitators and stuff, who are unrecognized. While this man walks into a Nobel Prize where he decided to put some of his personal fortune into making a movie.
I want to ask you also about the point the lady made, which is, I mean, you talked about the influence that poets had in previous centuries, say.
They thought they had.
They thought they had, at least, yes. Yeah. But I wonder whether, you know, the campaign groups that were mentioned, Greenpeace, Friends of the Earth, but I wonder whether they've become more of a channel for protest, you know, or for changing minds than literature. I mean, or do you think literature still has its place in terms of changing the way that people think?
Yeah, it works slower. But I mean, I think a lot of gestural protest is a little boring now. I mean, we can be talking about imagination. One of the ways we can use our imagination is actually protest, if you like. That's the wrong word, maybe, but try and make points in a more imaginative way than, you know, a kind of self-dramatization. I think it's also really important that if we're going to be deep ecologists, we should be deep ecologists. We should say, okay, no holds barred. This is a very, very urgent situation. We're not going to, you know, those groups are not going to compromise with business, are not going to try and be business friendly, are not going to say, yeah, we're not going to criticise any wind turbine, no matter where you situate it. You know, and in Shetland now, the people from Shetland are trying to stop 103 wind turbines being erected in Shetland on pristine peat, if you like, with danger to rare birds, which are supposedly protected by EU directives. And the Scottish government and this company Viking are just taking it all the way to crush these people. And they get almost no support from those kinds of organizations because they're ideological. They say, well, we're not going to say anything bad about this kind of technology because it's good technology. But that's like saying, I would be against electricity because I don't believe in the electric chair. You know, this is land that will never be recovered. It will be lost forever because people are just using ideology instead of rational thought in terms of our energy policy.
Okay, I'm going to go back to the audience if there are more questions. Anyone got a question? There's, so just, yeah. So I can't quite see you, I'm afraid. I can see you now. Hello.
Fracking is an issue among members of the public, but I haven't heard about any serious scientific studies of the effect of fracking on water quality and on wildlife. Maybe that's just I read the wrong things, but there certainly hasn't been much publicity if there has been.
Okay, we'll make that point. There was someone else, just hand up there.
Yes, has the panel any views on the idea that religious organisations should have an involvement in this debate in climate change? I know this has come up recently with a paper in Science, I think it was.
Yeah. And there was a lady just with a pencil.
This is really more, I think, of a comment that there is a wealth of work from artists who've been working with serious scientists since the first Stern report was published through an organization called Tipping Point. And it is places like the Royal Society where you could actually give more of a platform to that work because it's not publicized widely. It appears here and there, but there's a lot of it now since 2007.
And you think they should help?
I think The Guardian could have features regularly, week by week.
Oh, you're talking about Guardian, right? God.
Yeah, why not?
We've done Cape Farewell and a whole bunch of other stuff, so I'm not. I thought you meant the Royal Society, though. When you mentioned that as well, did you?
I think this is a great place for us to see this work and hear about it and meet the artists.
Right. Okay. I'm going to come back to John, I think, just to start with. I mean, you can take your pick of those, but there was a comment about fracking. Again, I wonder what part of literature or art might play in that debate. There's certainly been films, haven't there? Religious organisations, do artists have, and policymakers and scientists have the monopoly on influence here? Should religious organisations be involved?
There was actually quite a good film coming out, I guess Hollywood, you'd have to say, with Matt Damon as the main star, and I think this is why it got made, called Promised Land, about fracking. And it wasn't about the science of fracking. It didn't go into people's faucets bursting into flames or anything. It was about the way in which companies get communities and break them down so that they can do what they want with them. And what companies have done historically is to go into communities and say to these people here, we'll make you millionaires if you let us do this. Now, the rest of the community is ignored, and they are certainly not going to be millionaires. In fact, they'll probably be worth even less than it currently is. But that's the divisive way in which they do this. They do this also in other forms of energy. They go into the community and say, oh, you will do this in your field, and you get lots and lots of money. Your neighbor will get nothing, of course. Your neighbor could happily watch all of the birds being chopped to pieces by your wind turbine, say, for example, or smell the byproducts of whatever you're doing. But the politics is important, and films can't really, I don't think a film can really talk about the science without becoming rather boring or else reductive, but they can talk about the politics, and I think that's what we should be addressing.
Right. John Pickett, I was going to come to you in that, John Burnside's mentioned not just science isn't just a part of these debates when it relates to whether it's pesticides or climate change or fracking, but businesses as well. I'm just wondering, because you work in an area where there are, of course, big companies working, making the investments to bring forward those products that can help us grow food. I'm just wondering how, you have navigated that world between the sort of companies and the politics and the science and so on.
Well, I suppose I have to say I haven't presumably navigated it too well, because I'm continually being accused of working for big companies and thereby having my views determined by them, and that isn't true. And I don't think it's true of most scientists, even though I may disagree with some of their own conclusions and the work they've done. I think the fact is that science should be there to provide evidence, to test hypotheses and invent new things. I think it's very, very important that there is honest engagement, not just with sections of society, business managers, politicians, or the people. It needs to be with everybody. So we're all in the game together.
Including religious organisations, as the questioner asked?
I think that belief-based views, whether it's religion or whether it's prejudice against technologies or advocacy of other technologies, I think it's fine, provided that where decisions have to be made collectively, that we can use evidence-based decision making where we've got evidence, and if we haven't, we have to get some. And so that is my answer. It is that we should move as far as we can to evidence-based decision making, but with choice in terms of where the demarcation between resources goes. I mean, what do people want? Okay. Do they want more fossil fuel, or do they want to have a more sustainable fuel source? Do they want to have more sustainable food production, or do they want to have food production that's based on the technologies that we have now, which, as I said before, won't deliver?
Kerry, I want to come to you, and John Burnside mentioned the Matt Damon film that's coming up, Promised Land, and made me think of Erin Brockovich, which obviously did, was a very successful movie. And I wonder, again, in your role, having been involved with the UN in these negotiations, whether you think it's important that those kind of personal stories get told, and sometimes art is quite good at that. As we've talked about before, science can provide a certain level of evidence, and that can be put into the mix, but there's more to that. There's more to decision making than sometimes than that. And I'm just wondering, is art, we've talked about Silent Spring, but other ways, is that a good way of getting those human stories into these negotiations?
Yes, I think you've hit a very important point, because it's all very vast and impersonal, isn't it? Adduced evidence, and to tell individual stories is very powerful. And I think they're different audiences, because there's people who go about their business and are perhaps not regularly involved in the environmental issues that we've been discussing this evening. And for them, a personal story like that may capture their imagination and make them not flick past the leader in The Guardian next time they're reading The Guardian, or actually read and think about what's going on. So I think that's an easy win for films and other things. Whether that kind of medium helps people who are kind of working in the field and already grappling with the science, I don't know. I think actually it probably does, because people use those stories. It's the kind of dinner table discussion, isn't it? You're at a dinner party, somebody says, what do? You say, I work in biodiversity conservation. They say, what's that? And you tell them the story. And they don't want to know that at 3 a.m. you were working on UNEP/CBD/6/10/L.1 paragraph 4.3 bis, and they don't want to know it. But if you can tell them, well, actually it was about this, then it's much easier to capture people.
Okay, that's great. We are almost running out of time. Actually, we've probably got time for one more question. If I'm sorry, you've had one already. The lady right at the back. Right.
Hello, my name is Dr. Alanisi. I'm a physician by background, and I wanted to share a curiosity that I have. One of the concerns that we have in medicine in particular is the amount of evidence that we can get. There's a large publication bias, and a lot of pharmaceutical companies only publish 20% of the actual trials that they do. I wanted to get a better understanding of the evidence we have available in environmental sciences, if this affects us as well. Where do we get the evidence from? Is it mainly funded by the same companies that make these products? Thank you.
Okay, good question. And there was another gentleman, got his hand up there. I think.
Thanks very much. Chris Rapley. I trained as a physicist, and so I'd just like to caution about evidence-based decision-making. Firstly, facts are slippery things, and they can be interpreted, as we've heard from our lawyer. Secondly, that there's a balance of evidence in complex circumstances, and so one has to weigh evidence because there's always some piece of evidence that seems to contradict. And thirdly, the neuroscientists tell us that, that evidence alone is not sufficient for humans to make decisions. There's always emotion involved in making a decision. And in fact, people who've suffered insults to their brain that removes their contact with the amygdala but retain their cognitive facilities simply can't make decisions. So I think this idea that just the evidence is sufficient is false.
Great, thank you, Chris. Let me come to you first, John, and Chris made a very interesting point there that people can't make decisions without emotion. Evidence isn't enough. I mean, in a way, that suggests, I think, that the people who work in your world, in the world of art and literature, have this incredibly valuable role to play.
I mean, I agree with you, obviously, and but the other thing I think is important to point out is that even if you were able to make decisions based on all the evidence you had at the time, unintended consequences. There's a nice, popular, kind of general, quite accessible book by a guy called David Owen, who's not the politician, but who's a New Yorker correspondent, called The Conundrum, which is really good about this question of what happens when you do, with the best will in the world, you apply this technology to this problem, and then this thing over here, this monster over here, comes in and devours everything. And it's really important to remember that no matter how much evidence you may gather, if you're dealing with the natural world, something unexpected is going to happen, right? But yeah, I think scientists, would like to say, we're objective. I mean, for me, objectivity is actually a myth, and there's a lot of people who've written about this. But the idea is we're objective, therefore what we're doing is cool and dispassionate. But I do believe that there's all kinds of underlying things like tribal loyalties and emotions and Arthur Stanley Eddington was told to debunk Einstein's theory because Einstein was a Hun, right? I mean, they just happened to pick the wrong guy because he was
very
a Quaker.
tribal. Yeah. Let me come to John Pickett then. Is objectivity a myth? And
I think that was a very good point. I think perhaps I've been slightly cornered into defending evidence base as if it's a totally foolproof entity. That's not really what I mean. I do agree. I mean, it relates to risk assessment. I mean, we're quite good at doing that. We decide whether to smoke or not, whether to cross the road, drive a car, and so on. And yet we have real problems in looking at whether a pesticide is giving some danger to a small section of the flora and fauna, at the same time as having to appreciate that it actually is a means of generating food, not for the avarice of the company that sells it alone. So I think, but nonetheless, it ought to advise us. And I think that the question that was raised about whether the environmental impact studies are in some way not useful to us. The comparison, I think, was made with some clinical trials.
Bias, yeah, which has been demonstrated very clearly in the pharmaceutical world.
I mean, briefly, I think the fact is that companies have to pay £200 million to register a compound. That's an enormous amount of money. It goes to state sector agencies to review that work. They have to do the work themselves. It's done according to very strictly controlled regimes. It's the best we can do. It'd be very unlikely that a company, seeing itself as an ethical company, would deny the sanctity of that. But on the other hand, it's what we do.
Yeah. Okay. You could argue with such a large amount of money invested, you'd have to defend it to the ends of the earth. But
no,
listen.
What it does actually, it's very sad, but it means that you tend to want to get your money back with a pesticide, say, that deals with a lot of pests rather than one specific, highly targeted one.
Good point. I'm going to finish with Kerry. I want to come back to that idea about emotion because, going back to the very start of this, we're talking about Silent Spring. Well, don't worry, I'll make it slightly easier. But we talk about Silent Spring and Rachel Carson's book, and that has created a movement. There's, by some people's arguments, in terms of the environmental movement, there's a lot of emotion involved in that in all the different ways. And I'm just wondering, looking forwards in terms of making decisions about how we protect the planet, deal with environmental problems. I'm just wondering, given that you've had involvement in that through the UN, whether emotion, whether that's influenced by movies, as we talked about before, is that part of the process? I mean, is it possible to sort of have this passionate, objective thing where the right answer comes out?
Well, because we're human beings, the answer is no. Of course, it isn't possible to do things dispassionately, but you wouldn't want the exact counterfactual, would you? You wouldn't want everything to be decided purely on emotion. Of course, we've got to do our very best to adduce good evidence, but we've got to know that other things are taken into consideration as part of that. And we've talked a lot about sciences. We haven't really talked all that much about economic evidence, because clearly the overriding factor that's influencing most environmental policy at the moment is the economics of it. So.
Great, well thank you very much. I'm afraid we've run out of time. I hope someone in the audience has been inspired to write the great climate change novel and change the earth. If so, we'll certainly have achieved something. But I'm sure you'll agree we've had a fantastic discussion, and I'm very grateful to the panellists, John Burnside, Kate Carter and John Pickett. And if you can join me in appreciating that, I'd be grateful.
The Royal Society of Literature, I just want to add my thanks to the panel for that extremely entertaining and wide-ranging and informative conversation. And I'd also like to thank Damien for his excellent sharing and all his contributions. I was particularly interested because, in fact, although I went on to do other kinds of writing, mostly literary biography, my first book when I was working as a young journalist was based on interviews with environmental scientists and was greatly influenced by Rachel Carson. And also what inspired me was when the Wreath Lectures were given by a man called Frank Fraser-Darling, and I was sent off to interview him about the Wreath Lectures, so that got me started. It's a subject dear to my heart, and I've learnt a lot, and thank you very much. The Royal Society of Literature is very proud of this series of conversations we have every year with the Royal Society, and grateful to the Royal Society for hosting this. It's one of the opportunities we like to take to show that although we do mostly have literary events in which writers talk to each other about each other, we do sometimes lift our eyes from our desks, our computers, the inside of our own heads, and look out. And I think it's incredibly important that a literary society does do that. I would like to say to all of you that the Royal Society of Literature is open to everybody to become a member, and all our events are also open. There's some literature outside if you'd like to hear more about us. And among the events we've got coming up in the next few weeks, there is one, Fiona McCarthy is talking on William Morris at the National Portrait Gallery. We've got an evening on the Sri Lankan novel. We've got Ale Kennedy talking about short stories. And then we also have Lionel Shriver, who's just won the BBC Short Story Award, talking for us on the 9th of December. And we'd be very pleased indeed if any of you wanted to come to any of those. I'd also like to say we're very grateful indeed to Bath Spa, who are our season sponsor. And once again, really, I would very much like to thank everyone here on the panel, on the platform, for the fascinating evening they've given us, and thank you for coming.